You're wrapped in 3 blankets, teeth chattering, while your skin feels hot enough to fry an egg on. Every instinct in your body is screaming that something has gone catastrophically wrong. Your first move, almost on autopilot, is to reach for a pill that will make the whole miserable sensation go away as fast as possible. But here's the strange twist. What if that burning, shivering, utterly wretched feeling isn't a malfunction at all? What if it's your body deliberately executing a battle plan that predates the dinosaurs, that predates trees, that predates almost every complex form of life you can think of? To understand why your body would ever choose to make you feel this bad on purpose, you first have to understand something more basic: why any living thing bothers to care about temperature at all. Every organism on this planet, from the simplest bacterium to the largest whale, exists inside a temperature range. There's a narrow sweet spot where its internal chemistry hums along at peak efficiency, and a wider, more punishing zone on either side of that sweet spot where it can survive, but only just, and only for a while. Push an organism far enough outside even that wider survivable range, and its proteins start to unravel, its membranes stop working properly, and it dies. Life on Earth manages to squeeze into extraordinarily different corners of that temperature spectrum, from microbes clinging to existence in icy sub-zero brine pools to heat-loving organisms thriving near boiling hot deep-sea vents. But every single one of them is still operating within some version of the same basic rule. Too cold, and everything grinds to a halt. Too hot, and everything breaks apart. Humans happen to be warm-blooded, which sounds simple enough until you actually think about what it costs. Being warm-blooded means your body spends a staggering amount of metabolic energy around the clock, whether you're awake or asleep, active or resting, just to keep your internal temperature locked in at roughly 37 degrees Celsius, or about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold-blooded animals get to skip this bill entirely. A lizard can let its body temperature drift up and down with its surroundings, and simply bask in the sun or retreat to shade to regulate itself, spending almost no internal energy on the problem. At first glance, our approach looks needlessly wasteful, like running a furnace at full blast in a house with the windows open. But that wasteful furnace buys us something remarkable. At a steady 37 degrees, we are almost completely immune to one of the most common and lethal categories of infection on the planet: fungal disease. Colder-blooded animals are frequently overrun internally by fungal infections that would simply struggle to survive inside a human body, because we are, from a fungus's point of view, permanently and uncomfortably hot. Being warm all the time isn't just a side effect of being a mammal. It functions as a defense system that's always switched on, quietly working in the background of every single day of your life, whether you're sick or not. Fever is what happens when your body decides that background defense isn't enough and cranks the whole system up on purpose. The moment bacteria or viruses manage to get past your outer defenses and establish a foothold inside you, a diverse family of chemical alarm signals called pyrogens gets released into your bloodstream. Some of these pyrogens come directly from the invading microbes themselves, essentially broadcasting their own presence without meaning to. Others are produced by your own immune cells as soon as they detect trouble, like a security guard hitting a silent alarm. These pyrogens travel through your blood and eventually reach your brain, where a cluster of specialized receptors picks them up and responds by resetting your internal thermostat to a new, higher target temperature. It's a bit like someone sneaking into your house and quietly turning the thermostat from 20 degrees up to 25. Except the house, in this case, is every cell in your body, and the goal is to make that house unbearable for the trespasser while remaining livable, if uncomfortable, for you. Once that new, higher setting is locked in, your body springs into action to reach it as fast as possible. And this is where the shivering comes from. Your skeletal muscles begin contracting rapidly and repeatedly, generating heat as a byproduct in exactly the same way that vigorous exercise warms you up, except this contraction happens involuntarily and continuously. At the very same time, blood vessels near the surface of your skin narrow and constrict, cutting off the usual flow of warm blood to your extremities and trapping heat deep in your core instead. This is why you can be burning up on the inside while your hands and feet feel genuinely cold to the touch, and why you instinctively reach for blankets even though your internal temperature is already climbing. None of this comes for free. Fever is a full-body, energy-intensive project, and your metabolic rate climbs by roughly 10% for every single degree Celsius your temperature rises. That's an enormous ongoing energy cost, which is exactly why fever also comes bundled with an unmistakable, almost non-negotiable order from your own body. Stop what you're doing, lie down, and conserve every scrap of energy you can, so the immune system has enough fuel to actually finish the fight. Back at the site of infection, the picture is just as dramatic. When bacteria first slip past your defenses, their strategy is usually to stay quiet and avoid detection for as long as possible. But once your immune system notices them and the battle is properly underway, the bacteria typically switch into an entirely different mode: aggressive, high-speed replication, throwing every available resource into multiplying as fast as they possibly can before your defenses can catch up. This is already an intensely stressful, resource-hungry state for a bacterial cell to be in. Not unlike trying to sprint a marathon, eat a full meal, and give birth all at the same time. Multiplying that fast leaves very little room for error or resilience. Now add a sudden, dramatic rise in ambient temperature on top of that already precarious state, and things start to go wrong for the invaders very quickly. Heat causes their proteins to misfold and lose their functional shape. It makes their outer membranes leaky and unstable, and it damages their genetic material, all of which sabotages their ability to keep dividing and slows the infection down at exactly the moment it's most vulnerable. Meanwhile, on your side of the battlefield, the same rise in temperature has almost the opposite effect. Virtually every other system in your body works somewhat worse during a fever. Digestion slows, concentration gets foggy, physical performance drops, but your immune system is the one glaring exception. It actually performs better in the heat. Neutrophils, one of the first responder cell types in your bloodstream, get recruited to the site of infection faster. Macrophages and dendritic cells, which specialize in engulfing and digesting invaders and then presenting evidence of the attack to the rest of your immune system, become noticeably more efficient at their job. Natural killer cells get better at recognizing and eliminating infected cells. On top of all that, fever triggers a kind of engineered famine at the battlefield. Your body begins actively hoarding critical resources that microbes desperately need to keep multiplying. Things like iron, glucose, and glutamine, pulling them out of general circulation and locking them away where invading bacteria and viruses can't easily get at them. The bacteria aren't just facing heat damage anymore. They're trying to wage an aggressive, resource-hungry war in the middle of an induced famine. Viruses don't get a pass either. Different viruses have wildly different tolerances for heat, and this shows up in surprising, very specific ways in the human body. Take the rhinovirus responsible for the ordinary common cold. It's essentially confined to your nose and upper airway, and one major reason for that is temperature. Your nasal passages run a degree or two cooler than the rest of your body even when you're perfectly healthy, simply because they're closer to the outside air you're constantly breathing in. That small, everyday temperature gap is enough for the rhinovirus to survive there, but nowhere else in your body. The moment a fever pushes your overall temperature up, even that narrow, cool refuge starts to close, squeezing the virus out of the one environment where it was ever comfortable to begin with. Your own healthy cells are not entirely immune to all this heat either. And here the story takes an unusually clever, almost self-sacrificing turn. When a cell, whether it's your own or an invader's, gets pushed toward the upper edge of what it can tolerate, it starts producing a defensive family of molecules called heat shock proteins. These act like emergency repair crews, rushing in to stabilize and refold proteins that are starting to come apart under the heat, buying the cell precious time to survive the stress. It's an elegant, short-term fix, but it comes with a hidden catch. If a cell has to produce an unusually large number of heat shock proteins just to stay intact, that's not a neutral fact. It's a visible, chemical signal that this particular cell is under serious, possibly unsustainable distress. Your immune system has effectively learned to treat a flood of heat shock proteins as a distress flare rather than a private repair job. Specialized natural killer cells and killer T cells are drawn directly towards cells producing unusually high levels of these proteins, and they respond by destroying those overwhelmed cells outright, along with any viruses hiding inside them. In trying to desperately patch themselves back together, infected cells often end up broadcasting exactly where they are and get torn down as a result. It's a bit like a building's fire suppression system being wired so that any room running its emergency sprinklers too often automatically gets sealed off and demolished, on the logic that a room needing that much emergency repair is probably too compromised to save. All of this raises an obvious question. If heat is such a powerful and sophisticated weapon, why haven't the microbes that plague us simply evolved to shrug it off after hundreds of millions of years of being on the receiving end of it? In a narrow sense, some certainly have started to, but fever appears to have a clever trick built in that keeps outmaneuvering that kind of evolutionary escape. If a particular pathogen manages to survive repeated bouts of fever across many hosts and many generations, natural selection will gradually favor whichever individual microbes happen to tolerate heat slightly better than their peers, and over enough generations, a genuinely heat-resistant strain can emerge from that pressure. That sounds like a clean win for the microbe, until you consider what has to happen next in its life cycle. It needs to leave its current host and infect a new one, and that new host, assuming they're healthy, is going to be sitting at a completely normal, non-feverish 37 degrees. A strain that has spent generations specializing in surviving extreme heat is, by definition, no longer as finely tuned to comfortably invade a calm, ordinary, non-feverish body. Fever doesn't just fight the infection currently in front of it. In a very real sense, it also sabotages that lineage's next move, forcing an uncomfortable trade-off between surviving today's fever and thriving in tomorrow's healthy host. Some pathogens have found a different way around this dilemma entirely. Instead of trying to outlast the fever, they try to outrun it. Measles is a textbook example of this hit-and-run strategy. The measles virus reaches its absolute peak infectiousness in the window right before a fever fully kicks in, essentially front-loading all of its transmission opportunity into the earliest, most vulnerable stretch of the infection. By the time your full immune response, fever included, finally arrives in force, the virus gets brutally beaten back, but by then it has usually already accomplished its real objective, spreading itself onward to the next host, weeks or days before your defenses caught up. This kind of arms race, heat resistance on one side, speed and timing tricks on the other, has apparently been playing out between fever and pathogens for an extraordinarily long time. Some estimates place the origin of fever as a defense mechanism at roughly 600 million years ago, and it shows up in an enormous range of animals today. Fish will actively swim into warmer waters when they're sick, seeking out heat the same way a mammal generates it internally. Lizards will deliberately bask longer in direct sunlight. Bees, remarkably, will collectively raise the temperature inside their hive when disease threatens the colony, essentially giving their entire home a coordinated fever. Warm-blooded mammals like us simply have a far more dramatic, far more internally controlled version of the same ancient trick. It's worth pausing here on just how deeply this idea is baked into medical history, even before anyone fully understood the biology behind it. In the early 20th century, doctors treating late-stage neurosyphilis, a devastating infection that at the time had essentially no effective treatment, discovered almost by accident that deliberately infecting patients with malaria and the high fevers that came with it could dramatically improve their condition because the heat-sensitive syphilis bacteria simply couldn't survive the induced fever nearly as well as the patient could. That approach, sometimes called fever therapy or pyrotherapy, eventually earned its discoverer a Nobel Prize, decades before anyone had mapped out pyrogens, heat shock proteins, or nutritional immunity in any detail. In other words, doctors were deliberately weaponizing fever against disease long before science could explain exactly why it worked. That history sits in interesting tension with our modern instinct to treat any fever as an enemy to be shut down as quickly as possible. Which brings us to the genuinely practical question sitting underneath all of this. Given everything fever appears to be doing for you, should you actually take something to fight it the next time you're sick? Part of the modern reflex to reach for a pill has less to do with biology than with habit and history. Cheap, reliable, Over-the-counter pain and fever medications like aspirin and ibuprofen have only been widely and affordably available for roughly the last century or so, a genuinely tiny sliver of time compared to how long humans have been getting sick. Walking into a pharmacy and picking up something for a headache or a fever is, in the grand scope of human history, an extremely recent convenience, and it has quietly rewired our expectations about discomfort in general. Pain, in particular, is meant to be felt. If you're sick, you're supposed to feel bad enough that you lie down, slow down, and conserve the energy your immune system needs to actually do its job. That unpleasant feeling isn't a design flaw in your body. It's a feature, doing exactly what it evolved to do. The trouble is that pain and fever are chemically intertwined, which means the same over-the-counter medications that dull pain, like ibuprofen and paracetamol, also happen to suppress fever as a side effect, whether or not that's actually what you wanted. This gets especially complicated with children, where fever is very often suppressed reflexively by well-meaning but worried parents, or sometimes by doctors under pressure from worried parents, frequently out of a mistaken belief that the fever itself is the disease, or out of fear that letting a temperature run its course might cause some kind of lasting damage. As a general rule of thumb, for most otherwise healthy people, a fever that stays below about 40 degrees Celsius, or 104 Fahrenheit, isn't considered dangerous and doesn't strictly need to be treated at all. There are, however, real and important exceptions to that general rule. Pregnant women, elderly patients, and people who are already seriously ill or medically fragile can be put at genuine additional risk by the extra metabolic strain fever places on the body, so caution is warranted for them specifically. Separately, any fever that climbs above 40 degrees Celsius is considered dangerous for essentially anyone, not because the heat itself is inherently catastrophic at that level, but because a fever running that high is usually a sign that the body's internal temperature control system itself is starting to fail, rather than functioning normally. Once you move into the territory of more serious diseases, the picture gets murkier and more genuinely uncertain. There's real clinical evidence that for illnesses like influenza and chickenpox, aggressively suppressing fever with medication doesn't actually help patients recover any faster, and in some cases may not help at all. Unfortunately, thorough research here runs into serious ethical roadblocks. It's extremely difficult to justify a clinical trial that deliberately withholds fever-reducing treatment from sick patients just to see what happens, which limits how much rigorous data we can gather. In one especially sobering case, doctors running a critical care study gave aggressive anti-fever treatment to seriously ill patients, only to have to halt the trial early after mortality rates among those patients climbed higher than expected. Taken together, the broader pattern in the existing evidence suggests that, for many infectious diseases, people may actually fare somewhat better with a fever running its course than without one. And there's remarkably little solid clinical evidence that actively suppressing fever leads to meaningfully better outcomes overall. That said, there are important exceptions worth flagging, particularly around neurological injuries and stroke, where the calculus can be very different. And there's broad agreement in the field that we need considerably more research before drawing firm conclusions across the board. So, should you actually fight your next fever with medication? Honestly, the most responsible answer is to talk to an actual doctor, rather than take medical advice from an internet video, this one included. But stepping back, the underlying decision really comes down to a genuine trade-off, rather than a simple right or wrong answer. If your fever isn't dangerously high and you can tolerate the discomfort reasonably well, letting it run its course is, in a meaningful sense, actively supporting your own immune defenses, and you might even end up recovering slightly faster as a result. On the other hand, if you feel absolutely miserable and you're otherwise young, healthy, and not in one of the higher risk categories, taking something to bring the fever and the pain down is a perfectly reasonable choice too, one that trades a small amount of immune efficiency for feeling functional enough to actually get through your day. Whichever way you decide to go the next time you're lying there burning up and feeling awful, it's worth remembering that your immune system is, at that very moment, having a considerably worse day than you are, deliberately turning your own body into a hostile environment for whatever's trying to live inside you. And there's a broader pattern worth sitting with here too. Modern life has quietly trained us to treat almost every uncomfortable bodily signal, not just fever, but pain, coughing, even the low-grade unease of ordinary anxiety, as though the sensation itself were the problem to be eliminated as fast as possible, rather than as information your body is actively trying to hand you. Fever is a particularly clear example of a signal that feels genuinely awful while doing something genuinely useful, and it's a useful reminder that feeling bad and being harmed aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the smarter, more effective move isn't to reflexively silence a system that's been quietly fine-tuned by natural selection for the better part of 1 billion years, but to actually understand what it's trying to do, and then make an informed choice about whether to help it or override it this time.